when we're looking at the cardiac conduction system right here, this cardiac conduction system is what allows us to have a rhythmic contraction every second if your heart rate is at 60 beats per minute, right? Every second you have a contraction. When you do, we say you have normal sinus rhythm. It starts with modified cardiac muscles that acts like a neuron. These modified cardiac muscles at the top right here form a node. Again, think of it as like a neuron. Right? This node is our main pacemaker. It stimulates. And it stimulates, then it causes the atria to contract first. And remember, the fibrous skeleton is found between the atrium and the ventricles. So when the SA node fires, it stimulates only the atrial cardiac muscles. And it allows the atrial cardiac muscles then to contract. Because of that electrical insulation, that message doesn't get sent to the ventricles immediately. There's a delay. That delay allows us to have this rhythmic contraction where the atrius gets stimulated first, it contracts, then we stimulate the ventricles. So then we have that nice rhythmic contraction. Again, this SA node is the pacemaker. The pacemaker is the one that stimulates each heartbeat. So then the atria contract first. Now keep in mind, your atrium wants to contract at a rate of about like 120 beats per minute. Your ventricle wants to contract at a rate of 30 beats per minute. So there's a mismatch, right? So in order to kind of meet in the middle, the SA node causes the atria to contract at 60 beats per minute and the ventricles at 60 beats per minute. If it wasn't for this SA node, your atria will contract 120 times a minute while your ventricles only contract at 30. And that is not efficient or effective. Right, so the SA node is the one that fires. The signal then goes to the atria, and then the atria contract. Now, as that happens, we're now going to eject blood from the atria to the ventricles. At that point, your tricuspid and your mitral valves are wide open, so then you can bring blood from the atrium to the ventricles. Now, your aortic, and then you should also see the pulmonic valve as well. Your aortic and pulmonic valves are closed. These two valves are true pressure valves, right? They're normally closed unless you develop enough pressure from below to pop them open. So the aortic valve has a pressure normally of 110 millimeters of pressure. That means just to open up that valve, the left ventricle has to contract. So then it develops a pressure of 110, just to open the valve, all right? And then you have to then eject blood. That's why it goes all the way to 120 if your blood pressure is normal. So these valves are usually closed until we develop enough pressure in the ventricles, right? So what do we do then? We stimulate the atria, we bring all the blood to the ventricles, and then we wait a millisecond. As we wait a millisecond, we stimulate afterwards the second node, the atrioventricular node. Right? This node then goes through the interventricular septum, where it splits into the left bundle branch and the right bundle branch. Some of you might have heard of a bundle branch block. That happens sometimes in people, all right? And it means that this pathway of electrical conduction that should be going to the left side of the heart and the right side of the heart is blocked for some reason, and now it's slowed down. The left bundle branch goes to the left atrium, the right bundle branch to the left ventricle, and then the right goes to the right ventricle. Now, we always start contracting at the apex. And what I want you to think is this, just like a water bottle. What happens if I take the water bottle up and start squeezing from below? If I start squeezing from below, all that water goes upwards, right? That's what's happening here. I'm going to squeeze from the apex up. As I squeeze from the apex up, that's where the contraction first happens. Well, if I squeeze from the bottom up, When blood want to go upwards, right, it wants to go back up. So what do we need to do? We need to prevent that blood from going back into the ventricles, from the ventricles into the atria. So as we start squeezing from the bottom, one of the first things we'll need to do is close the tricuspid and the mitral valves. As you squeeze, you close that valve, and those valves close to prevent backflow. So then blood doesn't go from the ventricles back into the atria. So we need to close those valves. And what happens then? Right? Again, these valves on top, the pulmonic and the aortic, those valves, they have blood sitting on top of it. There's pressure from the blood sitting on top. In the aorta right here, 110 millimeters of pressure. So even when we first start squeezing, you don't have enough pressure to eject blood yet. So the left ventricle and the right ventricle keep squeezing and increasing the pressure. Eventually, the pressure in the ventricles from squeezing exceeds the pressure in that valve. So the valve right here, 110 millimeters. We need to exceed 110 just to open the valve. It takes time for the left ventricle. It takes time for the right ventricle to squeeze and develop pressure. But with time, it does. So it goes from 0 to 120, and at 120, you pop open the aortic valve. At that point, you keep contracting so then you can eject blood out. And it all starts with that SA node, right? Now, keep in mind, once I eject blood into the aorta, right here, at the same time, blood in the right ventricle right here will get ejected into the pulmonary trunk. And what happens? You keep contracting the muscle, the ventricles on each side. In the left ventricle, you contract, the blood pressure goes to like 130 so that you can keep ejecting blood out. On the right side, the pressure goes to about 20 so you can keep ejecting blood out into the pulmonary trunk. Eventually though, the left and the right ventricle need to relax. As it relaxes, blood starts to come backwards, right? You ejected it up, and now because of gravity, because of resistance, right? What happens is blood that's in the aorta, that last little bit that you just ejected up, right, doesn't have enough forward thrust. Instead, it starts moving back down. As it starts moving back down, that blood that can't go anywhere else and moves back down, closes the aortic valve. That blood in the pulmonary trunk that you couldn't eject to the lungs moves back, closes a pulmonic valve. And now we have blood sitting on top of that valve, and that's the pressure that we have to overcome in the next cycle of contraction. So there's always a little bit of blood sitting on top of the aortic and the pulmonic valve. That little bit of blood sitting on top of those valves, well, that's from the previous contraction. And what happens? That is the force we have to overcome with the next contraction. Now, when you look at this, the SA node right here is the main pacemaker, right? And just review like the cardiac conduction system, and keep in mind that the reason why this cardiac conduction system works is because we have the fibrous skeleton separating the atria from the ventricles. So then when I stimulate the SA node, if I didn't have that fibrous skeleton, as soon as I stimulate the SA node, I would also stimulate the AV node at the same time. Then the atria and the ventricles contract at the same time. Not good. So that separation is important. So the SA node fires, causing the atria to contract. Then the signal goes to the AV node, and we're going to kind of sit it around a little bit in the AV node, let the muscle contract, let blood go into the ventricles finally, let that blood settle, and then the AV node fires. That signal then goes to the bundle branches, left and right, which then causes the left and right ventricles to contract. Again, here, SA node fires spontaneously at 90 to 100 beats per minute. Normally, if your heart rate at rest is at 100 beats per minute, we say you have tachycardia. Again, keep in mind, tachycardia is when your resting heart rate is at 100 beats per minute or more. If you're exercising, well, that's not considered tachycardia, right? If you're exercising and your heart rate doesn't go above 100, you're not really exercising, right? You're just kind of having fun. So you need to, in terms of exercise, increase it more to like 130, 140. That is normal when you're exercising. It's when you're resting and your heart rate is high that we worry. Right, so just review those. And we're going to talk about this part, electrical properties. And when we look at this, there's two slides I want you to know in terms of electrical properties. This one and this one. What's the difference? One is found only in the essay note. That's slide 30. So in slide 30, write down again, right? I highlighted it. Essay note action potential. By the way, you guys know I love like models and slides like this that show you right things and expect you to know these. I see it on the written part of your test. Right, we'll come back to it, don't worry, we'll come back. Now, this is, we'll start with the electrical properties of the cardiac muscle, right? Then go back to the electrical properties of the essay note. So let's talk about, this is your skeletal muscle action potential phases. I know, you guys didn't think you're gonna see it again, did you? Right, you did, right? Hopefully you remember when I mentioned we're gonna see it again last semester. So we start at minus 85 millivolts as our resting membrane potential in a skeletal muscle. Then what happens? You have voltage-gated sodium channels that open up, and they open up because of acetylcholine receptors. Remember, in skeletal muscles, all action potentials were triggered by a motor neuron. So the motor neuron releases acetylcholine at the neuromuscular junction. The acetylcholine binds to its receptors, which are sodium channels. As acetylcholine goes into the neuromuscular junction, the acetylcholine binds to receptors that then open up, allowing sodium to rush in. The sodium rushing in then allows voltage-gated sodium channels to open. And it's sodium channels from voltage-gated sodium channels, right? The sodium rushes in and it causes a spike that causes depolarization. Remember, sodium is positive charge. We were negative before, and now we're adding a lot of sodium. Now we become very positive right away. As the sodium goes in, it triggers an action potential in the plasma membrane. The action potential then gets carried from the plasma membrane down the transverse tubules. The transverse tubules will then be connected with your sarcoplasmic reticulum. As there's a voltage change in the sarcoplasmic reticulum, it causes voltage-gated calcium channels to open. Now, hopefully, I'm doing this kind of slow, so then when I link it, you can kind of, read it again. So the voltage-gated calcium channels, they open up. And then as they open up, calcium leaks into your sarcoplasm. The calcium then binds to troponin, moving tropomyosin out of the way, allowing myosin and actin to react again. That is, again, the actual pathway for muscles to contract. Now, for skeletal muscles, it's very important that we have a motor neuron that releases acetylcholine. That starts the whole process. For cardiac muscles, we don't need that. They're autorhythmic. They can start by themselves. So we don't need a motor neuron in terms of the heart muscle. They're autorhythmic. Now what else? Right? In a motor neuron, or let me phrase it, in the skeletal muscle, sodium rushes in, causes depolarization. In the cardiac muscle, sodium rushes in, causes depolarization. So the very start is the same. Voltage-gated sodium channels open. As voltage-gated sodium channels open, sodium rushes in, causing you to depolarize. Now, a couple things, hopefully in 201. In 201, I really made it an effort for you guys to know about action potentials, right? And how the muscles contract. This is why. Now, in 201, we talked about for a skeletal muscle to contract with strength and nice smoothness, you need it to activate the skeletal muscle multiple times. The more times you can activate it, the more calcium you release, the stronger and the more technic contraction we can have. Each time you stimulate, builds the strength, and then it becomes strong. Now, in a heart, what would happen if I keep stimulating the heart to build up strength? That's not good, right? The last thing you want is to just keep stimulating the heart by your motor neurons. If that happens, you will keep stimulating it continuously, and you'll never, and the heart rate will go like 200. That's not good. So in the heart, instead of stimulating it over and over again to have a nice strong technic contraction, we stimulate it once, but our action potential lasts for a longer period of time. So once we stimulate it, we're gonna let it become stimulated for a long period of time, right? So that's one of the big differences, is that in a skeletal muscle, to have a contraction that's nice, smooth, and strong, the motor neurons stimulate the muscles over and over again in a very short time frame. In cardiac muscles, that will cause us to have an arrhythmia. So instead of stimulating the muscles over and over again, so that we can keep the contraction and sustain contraction strength, we stimulate it one time, and instead, the action potential lasts, right? Think about it here. Here, you stimulate the skeletal muscle one time. The depolarization lasts 1 millisecond. That's it. Take a look at the cardiac muscle. You stimulate it one time, and because we have this prolonged action potential, right, you don't end until 500 milliseconds. This is 250 times longer that we stimulate the cardiac muscle. Now, why do we need to stimulate the cardiac muscle for that long of a time? Simple. Remember, in the aorta, you have blood sitting on the aortic valve. In the pulmonary trunk, you have blood sitting on the pulmonary artery above it. That closes those valves. In order to pop it open, we need to contract and develop pressure. As we develop pressure, well, that takes time for you to contract and develop that pressure. Eventually, there's enough pressure from below over here, and the pressure from below causes that blood to be ejected into the aorta. But that takes time. That's why we have such a long period of excitation in the cardiac muscle, right? So what starts it is identical, voltage-gated sodium channel, right? When we repolarize, voltage-gated potassium channel, right, allows us to recover. Same thing here, right? The big difference is this: in the cardiac muscle, you need a long, sustained contraction. So, in cardiac muscle, we have what's called a plateau phase. This plateau phase allows us to contract that muscle for long periods of time because we have a prolonged period of excitation. This is where calcium comes in. Calcium influx through voltage-gated calcium channel allows us to have this prolonged plateau phase so we can sustain contraction. As we sustain contraction, then we can open up the aortic and the pulmonic valve, right? But we don't go from zero, right? At rest, the pressure in the two ventricles is 0 millimeters of mercury. Somehow, we have to go from 0 to 110 just to open the aortic valve. Why is it 110? Because that's the amount of blood sitting on top of the aortic valve. You have to overcome that pressure. Well, it takes time to go from 0 to 110 millimeters of mercury of pressure. This is why you have that prolonged plateau phase, right? Eventually, you do pop open the aortic valve, you eject blood from the ventricles into the aorta, into the pulmonary trunk, right? And as you keep ejecting, the muscles at that point starts to tire. As they tire, they then recover and repolarize. Now, what causes it? Potassium moving out causes this repolarization. And this kind of slide just shows us that, number one, it is sodium coming in, causing that initial depolarization. And then calcium coming in, cause that really long period that we call the plateau. And then once we kind of ejected as much blood as we can, right, we are going to allow potassium to exit out. And that's why you see the potassium permeability increase here. All right, let's take a little break.